I want to welcome each of you here today to the 10th lecture in the National Human Genome Research Institute's History of Molecular Biology and Genomics lecture series, which is sponsored by the NHGRI's History of Genomics program. The NHGRI's History of Genomics program is an institute effort which was begun in 2012 to capture the history of the Human Genome Project and of subsequent genomics efforts. The program seeks not only to archive the historical richness of modern biological science and technology, but to actively foster dialogue and intellectual exchange between scientists and those scholars, like the speakers today, who actively study science. So it is in that spirit that I will introduce today's speakers and outline some of their key arguments and perspectives. So both of our speakers today, as they will outline in their talk, are drawing from their experience as historians and philosophers of science, using tools from rhetoric and from science education. The substance of their talk comes from their 2017 book, published by Routledge, entitled Darwinism, Democracy, and Race, American Anthropology and Evolutionary Biology in the 20th Century. Throughout the talk, Professors Jackson and Depew will present a series of arguments forming a cohesive dialogue between themselves, and there will be ample time for questions with the audience. So the first of our speakers, John Jackson, professor at Michigan State University, received his doctorate in history from the University of Minnesota. His publications include 2001's Social Scientists for Social Justice, Making the Case Against Segregation, but he has written or edited a total of 6 books on the history of racism and its role in science. He has also published several articles on evolutionary psychology. David Depew is Emeritus Professor of Communications Studies and the head of the Project of the Rhetoric of Inquiry, the POROI, at the University of Iowa. He was previously a professor of philosophy at California State University at Fullerton, and much of his work is in the history, philosophy, and rhetoric of evolutionary biology, where he is writing often with Bruce Weber. He also writes on ancient, specifically Aristotelian philosophy, biology and its relation to modern science, and how rhetoric, philosophy, and science have interacted with each other since antiquity. Most recently, his focus has been on the history of development of evolutionary biology. So, as I noted, many of the arguments presented here can be found in their book, which is a philosophical and historical critique of the race concept, as well as an in-depth discussion of the critiques of race by evolutionary biologists and anthropologists. The authors begin their discussion by outlining key terms in which they describe, from a philosophical view, how racism functions by arbitrarily, and I would add often ideologically and politically motivated classifications. They then present a historical overview of the misguided 19th century view that races were existing and could be reduced to a fixed set of biological features and characteristics. Depew and Jackson demonstrate then, as importantly, that this flawed, typological, fixed account of race was continually disproven as unscientific by evolutionary biologists to the degree that race, in the words of Ashley Montagu, was this is Montagu speaking, useless. They then outline how geneticists and anthropologists together agreed that modern evolutionary biology cannot have a notion of race, which reduces a group to a determinate set of biological features, a notion which becomes even more untenable given our ever-evolving understanding of human variation. Professors Jackson and Depew end by outlining some of the recent controversies concerning the resurgence of 19th century categorizations of groups in modern genetics. They use these most recent controversies around race and genetics and genomics to argue that scientists are not only not neutral when they make statements about race and genetics, but that such statements will be received as anything but neutrally by the public. It is the public, according to Jackson and Depew, who carry an infinite variety of understandings, some helpful and some harmful, which will inform their understanding of such claims far more than the scientific evidence. I would add to the ending discussion of their ending discussion of the importance of the history of discussions about race is that such a historical understanding is only useful if only for the realization that false ideological conceptions such as typological thinking never completely disappear, though they are constantly refuted. Rather, they simply move from public view for a short time and lie in wait to serve a reactionary, oftentimes political purpose. So with that, I turn the floor over to our two speakers, whom I thank for agreeing to give this talk here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Chris, and the other Chris, and everyone at the NIH who made this possible, and thank you for coming out today. I know you have other things you could be doing, and so we really appreciate your presence here today. So this is the book. You all should buy it. It's very expensive. So we have a lot to make up. And Chris already gave you a pretty good view of what this is, but essentially what David and I have tried to do here is try to explore the relationships between cultural anthropologists and evolutionary biologists throughout the 20th century, which served to undermine and debunk kind of essentialist categories of race. The anthropologists, mostly students of Franz Boas, if that name is unfamiliar to you, Boas. If anybody deserves the honor of the founder of American anthropology, it's Boas, a German Jew who emigrated to the United States, landed at Columbia University in 1900, and churned out people who then went on to found anthropology departments in places like Berkeley, Northwestern, all in this tradition of culture as an explanatory concept for human differences. And the interactions of those heirs of Boas and modern evolutionary theorists, particularly in the middle part of the 20th century, that serve to undermine kind of the older 19th century versions of the race concept. So what we're trying to do today is explore how scientists interact with each other and interact with the public in this kind of politically vexed field of race, and how scientists, when they address the public, this is science, this is the facts, this is the way things are. But the public is coming to this discussion, this interaction with scientific expertise, with a whole lot of preconceptions that may interfere, may boost the way they understand what they are being told by the scientists. And sometimes weird things occur, therefore. And so this last bullet point of when you as scientists try to talk to the public about issues like this, be aware that this is being heard in a context that may be quite different from the one that you have in your head as a researcher. So we want to start off with just some basic terms so you kind of get our position, where we're coming from when we discuss this. So the first one we want to talk about is racism. So one common thing that the public thinks they understand about racism is that racism is ancient. You can go back and read Greek texts and they're racist, and the Egyptians knew all about race. And that simply cuts against everything historians have discovered about the history of racism. It is in fact a very recent phenomenon, a product of modernity, a product of capitalism, a product of New World slavery. And these set of features is what I'm talking about when we're talking about racism. First, that people can be classified into distinct biological groups based on physical features. Second, that those physical features, which you can see, reflect inner mental moral characteristics, which of course you cannot see. Okay? So if the person looks this way, they have this kind of behaviors that's going to be associated with it. The characteristics are inherited, they're innate, they're built in. The traits are fixed, immutable, either by nature or God, take your pick. They both work equally well in the racist mind. And finally, they can be ranked in a hierarchy of value with our people up here and those people down there. Now, this suite of features could appear in pre-modern times here and there, but as a rule, all together are a product of late 18th, early 19th century thinking, historically quite recent. So this is the target of our critique, this set of ideas. Two more terms that we need to be aware of. Essentialism. There are some properties of X that X must have in order to be X. A triangle must have 3 internal angles that equal 180 degrees. 180 degrees? It's geometry. Geometry is where this works. In the world, it doesn't work so well. So imagine we have in front of us a table, and here is a golf ball, and here is a baseball, and here is a soccer ball, here is a basketball. They're different colors. That's not an essential feature of being a ball then, color. They're made of different materials, whatever the material is. Not an essential feature of being a ball. What's the essential feature? They must be spheres. That's the essential feature. That's what makes a ball a ball. Except for what? American footballs. This is why essentialism doesn't work so well, right? But that idea that you must have this property in order to be whatever X is. Typology is the language in which racial essentialism was expressed in scientific thinking in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so we're going to talk about, you can get at the essence of what a race is if you have the right type specimen that represents what that race is. It has these traits, it has those types. Okay? This will all become clear, I hope. David and I represent social constructionist position on race. Okay? Race is a social construction. What do we mean when we say that? So, when I was being trained in the 90s, there was a big science wars thing where social constructionists are pitted against scientists, and we're not talking about that kind of thing, if at all you're familiar with that. We are talking about 3 simple philosophical ideas that I think we need to get on the table here before we kind of jump into the history. First, the philosophical idea, nominalism. Whatever categories we have, a nominalist would say, are not part of nature. They are human constructions that we use to be able to sort through nature, which is composed only of individuals. So you can be a hardcore nominalist in which the only thing horses share is that we happen to call them horses. We don't need to go that far, but that idea, okay, so and I have an example in a minute. Contingency. The world we live in is contingent. If things had changed differently in our past, the world would look much different than it does. Washington, D.C., that was a contingent. It wasn't inevitable that D.C. be the nation's capital. It could have stayed in Philadelphia, except for human decisions which put it here. Explanatory force. Explanations are answers to why questions. So I'm going to ask you why, and you say the first word that pops into your head. Why? Because. This is the cause. This is why it looks the way it does, right? Why not? Thank you, whoever said that. Not helpful. The reason these categories persist is not because they are true in nature, but rather because there are social forces that keep it going. All right, 3 concepts: nominalism, contingency, explanatory force. Here's my example. We've all been to an amusement park, or not. You go to the roller coaster, you must be this tall to ride the roller coaster. Now look what this sign can do. It can divide people into 2 very clear categories. Tall enough, not tall enough. But the fact that it can do that does not necessarily mean that those are real categories, that the world naturally divides into people who are tall enough and people who aren't. Right? Even though epistemologically you can get a clear distinction here, right? That category does not exist in nature. a few changes, and maybe the category would change. If the roller coaster had been a little bit different, then we would have changed how tall it was, how tall enough is. Explanation could be entirely social. Maybe there's no real physical reason why a person this tall couldn't ride this roller coaster, but the insurance company is not going to let us do that. All right? So we are of the position that race is like the sign at the roller coaster. It doesn't exist in nature. It didn't have to look the way it does. And the reason it keeps going doesn't have anything to do with anything in nature, but rather with a lot of different social forces. All right, philosophy part over. The first section of the talk takes from 1859, publication of The Origin of Species, to around 1940. And here is the problem faced by people, scientists interested in studying race around that time period. They were convinced that race was real. They could see it every day. Obviously, race is a thing. It's there. Clearly, it's true. The problem is, nobody could figure out exactly what the proper racial categories were. So here's Darwin in 1871 listing just pick a number. I can give you a race theorist that thinks that's the number of races there are. Now, why should that be? Since, as the first sentence says, man has been studied more carefully, and yet there is no consensus about how many races there are. None. Problem, right? This is a problem that needs further research. Darwinism, however, poses an even greater problem to the idea of that there are fixed immutable races, simply which Darwin told us biological forms are never fixed and immutable. Darwinism is a theory of organic form. Organic forms are constantly on the move. Selection pressure changes species into other species over time. And if species themselves are not fixed and immutable, how can we say that a race is fixed and immutable, which is a smaller concept than species? It would seem that Darwinism would undercut any sort of notion that race is even a possible thing to have in the biological kingdom. And yet, their common sense, as they said at the time, if you can think about it, tells them race obviously is true. Here's the answer, the typological method of racial classification, a very famous book, The Races of Europe, published in 1899 by William Z. Ripley. Notice we're talking about the races of Europe. There are 3 European races. Bet you didn't know that. The Alpine, the Mediterranean, and the Nordic. What's the method? 3 things. Distribution of separate traits, anatomical traits in this case. The shape of the nose, the type of the hair. Those kinds of anatomical traits. You measure a bunch of traits. You associate those traits into types. People with this kind of hair and that kind of a nose and this shape of the face. And then if they're hereditary, that suite of traits, those types, then you have discovered a race. So one big measure of race is the cephalic index. The ratio, the ratio of the length to breadth of the head. This is a brachiocephalic skull, round. This is the much superior dolichocephalic skull, oval. I used to teach classes and make my students take their cephalic indexes until I found out that I am super brachiocephalic. And then I found that exercise less useful. The form of the head, right? So why choose that? Why choose the cephalic index? Ellsworth Huntington, a Yale geographer, talks about it in 1917. It can't be influenced by anything. It's just built in. You get it from your parents. It's not what we would say subject to selection pressure, right? Their food, their occupation, social, economic conditions, none of that will appear to hurt or appear to change the cephalic index. Meaning if you measure it, you can peek back through time because it's not subject to Darwinian selection pressure. And I would also note here, they well knew that complexion, skin color, what Americans tend to go to automatically when thinking about race, wasn't really on the table because they understood skin color was affected by selection pressures. Different complexions give you selective advantage in different environments. So, if you are a budding scientist in, say, 1920, wanting to be a good education in physical anthropology, you go to Harvard, work with this man, Ernest A. Houghton, Boaz's rival in many ways, committed to the idea of finding out what the proper racial categories are. Right? And here's his simple definition, and I just want to highlight we are measuring non-adaptive anatomical characteristics. This is our end run around Darwinism natural selection. We can glimpse into the primordial past of pure races if we measure all those anatomical traits that are not subject to selection pressure. Hence, races, in this view, are immune from Darwinism in some sense, and we can find true races by doing this. Here is the problem. Yes, it will be on the test. Which traits do you choose? Houghton's answer was just keep piling them on. I love this last. The list, of course, is not exhaustive. And can anyone in the room point to their postglenoidal tubercle? Nobody took anatomy. See, you'd never get out of Harvard in 1920. This is not the way good science operates. The problem was you had this method, and the more sophisticated and advanced the method became, the more the object of your inquiry started slipping away. Right? Good science conceivably does not act like that. Good science is the better your tools, the better your answers. Here, the tools just keep piling up, and the race categories disappear more and more. Clearly, by the end of the 30s, Houghton himself is giving up on this idea. Right? And here are just a few quotations from around that time. Jacques Barzoun, the great cultural critic, pointing out race is obvious, but nobody can tell us what it is. Ashley Montagu, who will appear later in this lecture, no one exactly seems to know, but everyone is most anxious to tell what race is. This last quotation from Sherwood Washburn, one of Houghton's prize students, who, in Houghton's view, stabs the old man in the back because of Dobzhansky's influence on Washburn, which David will talk about in just a second. And it's hard to argue with this. If we need to discuss racial matters with the Nazis, we'd better be right. World War II is on. And Washburn puts his finger exactly on the problem. We need ways of thinking about race rather than any particular classification. We have classifications in abundance. None of them have any consensus around them. Maybe the problem is the way we're trying to classify something, not a problem with any particular classification. So on that view, you're up.
So thank you all for coming, and thanks to Chris for a completely accurate description of what we're trying to show. Thanks to John for beginning to show it. Chris mentioned that we both had backgrounds in the history and philosophy of science before we went into public communication of science. But mine was more on philosophy, and history has come slowly to me. And he taught me really the fundamentals of archival research, which I said, how did I miss this in my life? This is the most wonderful thing. There is nothing better than reading dead people's mail. Except, talking to you, maybe dead people's genomes, reading dead people's genomes. So I think we together have represented a certain balance. And one more thing about our work together. The reason that our book is at all unique is that there are histories of anthropology that once in a while mention the effect of modern biology on it, population genetics and everything, but it's a kind of usually not handled very deeply. And the histories of evolutionary biology short-circuit race. But it's obvious when you read the archives that in the 40s, which I'm going to describe, these were, in the United States especially, these were deeply, deeply in contact with each other. And that you can't tell the story without telling it both simultaneously, and that's what informs our work. So what I'm going to talk about is the effect of the modern evolutionary synthesis on the questions that John described. And I'm going to do it quickly, and this is going to be, I don't have to give you a 2-minute tour through population genetics, but most of you already know it, but a lot of audiences don't. So the theme is going to be, you're going to be abandoning typology and the essentialism that typology presupposes, and you're going to restore natural adaptation. Now that is going to pose a challenge, because remember the idea of keeping typology and essentialism going depended on finding non-adaptive traits. And now you're going to go to adaptation. Your threat is going to be the revival of the kind of adaptationist racism that you don't want anywhere in sight. And this is what these people were struggling with, both anthropologists and evolutionary biologists. That's the theme anyway. So the modern evolutionary synthesis is built on population genetics, and it basically applied population genetic theorems to the problems of biologists. Starting in the late 1930s, and as I said, it rejected typology and essentialism by applying the fruits of the probabilistic revolution in 20th century science to the problems of evolutionary biology. Now, generally, a lot of this had to do with defining terms. You've got to remember when we report views, we're often, because we're working at the level of the concepts that people use to do their work, definitions are somewhat arbitrary. You can define things any way you want for some purpose. And so these are definitions of key terms that were adopted by most people in the modern synthesis, especially by those influenced by Dobzhansky. Evolution, what is it? It is, or at least is measured by, and there might not, for these people, not much difference between those two, changes in the frequency of one or more genotypes in a gene pool. Okay, the word gene pool was actually invented by Dobzhansky. A race is defined as a by Dobzhansky, a subpopulation in which the frequency of one or more genotypes changes, but not enough to prevent or discourage mating with conspecifics. What about species? Speciation occurs when evolutionary forces evolve genetic and not just geographical or physical barriers that lock variations into a population that no longer has sex for one reason or another with others in the. We have to bear these in mind, especially the idea that he is still at this point preserving the word race by redefining it. Okay, that's the key take home here, redefining it. Okay, now it is true that, as I said, the modern evolutionary synthesis restored Darwin's nearly orphaned idea that the most traits evolved by adaptive natural selection. And this was partly in the 20s, a statistical point. That is, that people like R.A. Fisher, especially R.A. Fisher, proved that mathematically genetic variations are not necessarily going to get swamped. There are ways in which very small genetic variations, if they have at the population level positive effects on reproduction rates, can be amplified to the point where they spread through a population and perform some function in it, which is thereby called an adaptation. On the other hand, there were the early Mendelians, as many of you know, were rather enamored with the idea that species occur through macromutational events or saltations. And what Fisher did by using the fruits of the probability revolution was to show that they have an extremely low probability of spreading through a population. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's very rare. So according to the modern synthesis, adaptive natural selection usually works. It's not adaptation purely, although there is this thing called adaptationism, but it almost always works in connection with genetic drift and with migration to evolve species. Like, you know what genetic drift is in small populations. Variations can take hold in a small population by chance, giving adaptive natural selection a foothold. That was Sewell Wright's great contribution when Dobzhansky became kind of a disciple of Wright for a while. And then there's migration. I mean, any small population that takes off and goes across the Bering Strait land bridge is going to bring with it some subclass of the gene pool that is with it. And anything that's in North America, when that migration closes again, that's it. That's the genetic variation you got, right? And you're all familiar with the consequences of that, some of which are at least one hypothesis about diseases that killed off Native Americans. Okay, so what are the lessons philosophically or conceptually? Is that on these views of these definitions, species and races are not classes whose members possess a set of essential defining properties. They are actually spatial temporal particulars that are in dynamic movements in space and time. They come into being by incipient genetic divergence, and they end when lineages split. So you have this idea, species are real, but they are real physical things that are tracked by studying flows of populations as they move around the globe. And this is why Darwin did have that insight, but he did not have enough possession of the statistical means to prove it, to actually carry his insight through, and it had to be delayed for another, 50 years or so until this people in the modern evolutionary synthesis forced this change of view. So this principle does in fact restore Darwin's conception of it. It makes it conceptually impossible to treat races and species essentialistically and typologically. Okay, Theodosius Dobzhansky was the most influential of these people, at least in one respect. He was the only one that was really, really trained in genetics. The other founders of the modern synthesis deferred to him in matters of genetics. There's a long story about his genetics, but the simple part is that he actually gave himself emigrated from Russia and got himself trained in T.H. Morgan's lab, which at first was in New York and then moved to Pasadena. He went with it. That's how that all happened. Okay, now this definition of his of race is going to be the thing that we want to concentrate on. Okay, races for him, because they're going to be defined as spatiotemporal particulars with beginnings and endings. He didn't like the idea not just of essentialism, but he didn't like the idea that a race could be defined as the sum total of its traits at all. He thought that just adding up sum totals of traits still had echoes of a kind of essentialist view. You say, well, if you got enough of these things, then you count as an X in the way that John was describing. What he thought, he used Mendelian traits such as eye color or bristle number in fruit flies as handles that allowed him to track changes in gene frequencies in subpopulations, which he called races, as they headed over transgenerational time, either toward or away from speciation. So he saw it as a dynamic concept that is moving in one direction or another, and you're using traits. It doesn't make any difference if you find such and such a trait useful. You're tracking that history by means of it. he thought he was restoring Darwin's idea of a race as a lineage, because if you look in the subtitle of Darwin's Origin, you'll say, or the origin of races by means of, now to use as races in this sense. But readers, of course, this provides a good example. Readers of Darwin's book would use the word races in their head. They're thinking still the typological conception of a race, maybe a European race, if there were such a thing. But what Dobzhansky and Ernst Mayr impute to Darwin was an intimation that these are already a dynamic concept that only exists as a way station either toward or away from speciation. Like, for instance, there were tendencies in the human history, you know this, to separate geographically into continental areas that between which, for a time, there was not that much migration and there was not much interbreeding, and we get maybe certain traits from that. But at a certain point in time, the tendencies of human beings to get together with each other worldwide absolutely overwhelm that, so that there's no possibility of thinking that we are not just completely one species. Nobody here is heading towards speciation, right? In fact, okay. So he did divide, giving this stipulative definition, which, by the way, was not always understood. You can divide them into races, but how many and which groups you name depends on what question you're asking and what genotypes whose historical trajectory you're following, and for what reason. In other words, in one way you can call this a social construction, but a social construction that actually pays its way by generating empirical knowledge could be called pragmatic, right? I mean, insofar as it unleashed a vast amount of research, it pays its way. You're actually learning real things about the world, as, for instance, you're tracking modern human populations across the globe. But he never meant to, he often would get interpreted as, so while I finish here, you can read these quotes and see that that is in fact what he's trying to say. Okay, so that kind of proves the point that I was trying to make. So that's his conception of it. Now, I'm going to turn it back over to John, because one of the people that Dobzhansky trained in genetics was the anthropologist Ashley Montagu. And the interaction between Montagu and Dobzhansky was extremely fruitful. And, but it also ended in a very interesting discussion or debate between the two, which is very relevant to the problems we still have. So thank you.
Yeah. Dobzhansky wanted to reach the public. This was an important message for him. He wanted to educate the public. He didn't want to be stuck in a lab. He wanted to reach out and write popular articles, write popular books, and had mixed success in so doing. One person he worked with was anthropologist Ashley Montagu, who he taught some population genetics to Montagu. Montagu taught some anthropology to Dobzhansky. And they both feared, as we discovered in this letter that Dobzhansky wrote to Montagu at the end, or nearing the end of World War II, that the racialists who, during World War II got a bad name are just waiting when they can speak out again and talk about racial superiority.
And the idea was to stop that.
And the idea was they wanted to stop that reemergence, what they thought of as a reemergence of racial thinking. And they thought they had the tools through population genetics and cultural anthropology. So there's Ashley Montagu, a rather dashing public figure. He had no permanent academic appointment. He made his living writing books for the public. He made his living appearing on television. Those of us of a certain age remember Johnny Carson. Well, he used to be on the Johnny Carson show, The Tonight Show. I don't think Jimmy Fallon would have him on. Jimmy seems to be into less maybe to play Jeopardy or whatever they do. One of the last PhD students trained by Boaz, and his insight, his argument was, with population genetics, just as Dobzhansky has described it, we should not be using this word race. Race comes with too much baggage. Let's eliminate it from scientific discourse and from public discourse. So one of the things you would learn as Dobzhansky's students was linguistics. And so he had a sophisticated understanding of language, right? And he would critique how anthropologists would use terms like primitive cultures or savages. He wanted to eliminate that kind of hierarchical thinking from anthropology, right? We need scientific specificity when we use these sorts of terms. In his most famous book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, he explains, just as Dobzhansky taught him, these are just temporary expressions of variations of, if we slice time in a different way, we'd have different populations. What we should use instead is this term, ethnic group, right? It eliminates obfuscating emotional implications and acknowledges cultural factors in our species that race obscures. Culture is completely separate from biology. We can explain why people live the way they do, why they eat the foods they do, why they dress the way they do, why they speak the languages they do, without resorting to kind of crude biological essentialism represented by racism. It's all learned behavior, cultural behavior. And so he tries to argue with Dobzhansky in this letter here, right, and other places as well, that Dobie is one of Dobzhansky's nicknames, Dobie, don't use the word race. Ethnic group, and I'm not going to spend any, I'm cognizant of the time here. Ethnic groups, use whatever baggage you have in your head, right? Ethnic groups are populations that have learned, have been enculturated in certain ways. This is Montagu on the slide didn't format quite the way I wanted it to. Montagu views are here on the left, Dobie's are on the right. They both agree populations are pragmatically defined groups. Okay? We group people however is useful for us. If we want to get people on the roller coaster, we use that sign. If we want to do something else, we group them some other way. Doesn't mean those are real groups that exist in nature. Montagu advised that this word race carries too much baggage. When you use the word, common sense will override the science of population genetics, and people are just going to plug in the common sense racial categories they've been carrying around, they've been acculturated with. Let's throw it away. Dobzhansky says, no. We need to teach people good population genetics so that when we use the word race, they know we're talking about this pragmatically defined group and not that older term of race. We can redefine the word. Ethnic group is a better term because it doesn't have that baggage of race. And Dobie says, you're dreaming. Racists will just say, oh, this ethnic group is inferior to us. And there's a letter that they're exchanging letters, and there's this wonderful letter that Montagu writes, how's it going, Dobie? Everything okay? And Dobzhansky writes back, oh yes, I'm still working with the fruit flies. The ethnic groups of fruit flies I have are doing quite well. Which also speaks to this notion that Dobzhansky wants kind of a unified science, right, where humans are part of the biological kingdom, where Montagu wants to argue, well, humans have culture, fruit flies don't. So those issues are still with us, and I'm going to turn this back over to David, right? So the idea is, if we can redefine race in population genetics terms, should we do that? Should we abandon the word race? Can we, in fact, educate people not to think essentialistically when we talk about race?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a moot point. It's been going on now all these years, and it's still a good question. So the only thing I'm going to do here as we draw to a conclusion is show that one of the big things that everybody in this room is quite aware of and has contributed to is the way in which molecular genetics has been a tremendous tool for population studies. So the same questions arise that arose then. So for instance, many of you know this result. Richard Lewontin was Dobzhansky's prize student. And why would he have done this? Because he really wanted to have this anti-racist biology does not support racism argument that he inherited from Dobzhansky's lab. He said, I never did anything that wasn't a product of my mentor's research program. He used gel electrophoresis, sort of the hard way, there were no machines, to show that at any given locus, now that's important, the average values show 85% of human genetic diversity is within arbitrarily chosen national populations and only 7.5 between nations and another 7.5 between major races. The idea was to discredit the idea of racial essentialism by showing that essentialism always exaggerates variation. One of the distorting factors, if you're looking at race concept or population concepts, is from a pragmatic point of view. That is with respect to the actual empirical knowledge they help you. So you have to worry about biases there, built-in biases that come with the concept that you're using. That happens all the time. The idea here is to prove that essentialism always exaggerates variation within groups and always underestimates it between them. And secondly, especially applicable when you apply it to health, it always treats differences as defects, has that tendency. And those are things to really watch. He was trying to discount that. But several people beginning in the early 2000s, Edwards and Feldman, other people, show that as you take traits, you're not talking here about a single locus. You begin with a trait. Dobzhansky says you can follow any traits you want, right? Depending on what you're doing. As you add traits, it's easier and easier to identify what race, in the conventional sense, to which an individual belongs. Race is as defined by, for instance, the United States Census survey, right? So it's possible to group people in a worldwide sample into clusters that correlate strongly with quote, quote, popular categories: African, European, East Asian, Oceanian, Native American. I took that from David Reich just because I like the sentence, but the claim is actually all the way back further than that. So Edwards accused Lewontin of fallacious reasoning, but actually, in fact, they're not fallacious. They're measuring different things, right? Then, not long ago, in 2015, New York Times scientist journalist Nicholas Wade argued that Edwards and Feldman provide support for the traditional race concept. We didn't get into a man named, another student of Houghton named Kuhn, who had this idea that the continental races are adapted to their continental origins, and that when you move them across the world, they encounter a more than average number of disabilities because they've changed the environments. That's a kind of adaptationism that Dobzhansky was trying to get away from, and he broke with Kuhn for that very reason. Actually, in defending this view, Wade said, race, that's not quotational, is a perfectly good English word, right? Then in David Reich, in a New York Times editorial, which caused some comment, he rejected Wade's interpretation, and he says you can cure the problem by putting the word races in little square quotes, from which I can hear in the background Montagu saying, in your dreams, that isn't going to happen. They're just going to take the quotation mark out and say, see, it proves the existence of the continental races. So I don't mean to resolve this conflict, comment on it or anything, just to tell you the same problems are with us. And they still are. And if you read the comments, for instance, on David Reich's editorial, which are on New York Times, there's a comment thing on it. I've read at least 200 of them. This whole lecture gets repeated in there in this polemical way by hundreds and hundreds of speakers who weigh in. The past becomes a kind of burden in which it recapitulates itself and gets itself ever more confused. Okay, so what's the moral of the story? It is important to recognize, for scientists love to report facts. And they expect that the facts are going to be received as facts. That's the way that you talk to each other when you're giving presentations, right? But you have to be recognized, and I think our little speech here is kind of a way of trying to prove this message, or the necessity of the message. They may not be received in the spirit in which they were intended. I am pretty sure that David Reich was fairly surprised by the reaction that he got. It's not enough to tell the public about newly discovered facts. Audiences will either assimilate them to what they think they already know, or they will discount them. Why? Because decades of science education research, and this was done in classrooms about how students learn, but it's applicable to the general public, because people's ideas are fairly formed when they get out of school, and depending on where they went to school and at what level they stopped. The so-called deficit model of learning, in which you can illuminate people by just putting facts into their heads and letting the facts stick, is just empirically false. That is not how good teaching of science works. You have to assume that they already have a model, a working model in their head. Where they got it is, who knows, right? But a good teacher from kindergarten on has got to try and figure out where they're coming from and what's latently inside of them, bring it out, and then try to take them beyond it. Okay. Yes, what I was saying, they carry implicit theories by which they interpret what scientists tell them. I think it's only by unearthing these theories and leading audiences from them to something better that they make progress. And these presupposes that teachers, journalists, scientists, people who speak to or write for the public are able to recognize where the students and audiences are coming from and try to find the what Aristotle would call the most appropriate means of persuasion to move you from point A to point B, and once you get B, go to C. Okay, all right. We think that the history, so what is often passes for common sense, one more last point, is actually common sense is not all that common. It's not built into human nature. Essentialism may not even be built into human nature. Elite theories of 100 years ago often take up residence in the brains of successive generations, where they stay there for a very long time and become an interpretive framework. Most people you're talking to in the American public are still dealing with Darwinism in 19th century terms. They're fighting 19th century battles. So it's not a question here of telling scientists, journalists, and teachers what to say or what to think, but of allowing their creativity, your creativity, to find new ways of showing how the past turned into the present. And it's in this spirit that we've reconstructed key moments when scientific met public sphere discourses. Thank you. Main button. Oh, yeah, we do communicate.
Okay, so questions. And before you ask a question, just say who you are and which NIH institute you're from. And if you're not with an NIH institute, say that you're not with an NIH institute and where you're from, which is not NIH. So, please.
Write that down.
Hi, I'm Alan Minton from NIDDK. I'd like to ask our speakers how you can, or how can scientists overcome the sticking power of ideas that go back as far as the Bible, when you say that the sons of Noah were the foundation of 3 races, and this idea is really gotten a lot of traction. How are we going to deal with that?
Well, that's the hard question. Oops. Are you hearing me? Yeah. I'm going to turn this over to John to see what he says. We didn't tend to give any advice, but except that you should do it. So I'm sorry. I do think that I do think that the key is to recapitulate the history and put it in its original context, and then show how the context change. Now, the problem with that is the economy of time. Let's suppose you're in a biology class. Let's just make it in that context for a minute. You got an agenda to do. You got stuff to go through. Concept comes up. It's very difficult to spend the time saying, well, you see, this concept was originally there, and it may be stuck inside of your head, but it was replaced by this. But something like that has to be done. I believe is the only way to do it. Recapitulating the past and leading people to the present. That's a very vague answer. Maybe John has something more concrete.
Well, I think there's a difference here between ideas that really are ancient and claims that this is an ancient idea. So one way to combat, for example, the biblical narrative of the sons. So let me start here. How many people know this story of the sons of Ham and the cursed races?
I don't.
Not many people know this already, right? So the idea is there's this biblical story about the sons, Noah's sons, and Ham gets cursed, and that's why black people are inferior because of this curse, which is claimed to be this ancient sort of story from the Bible, but actually that interpretation is very recent in biblical scholarship. It's a post hoc rationalization in some ways of racialized slavery. So this idea that I started with, that racism is actually a brand new idea, historically speaking, is one way. You go back to antiquity. The evidence is quite clear that in ancient Greece, for example, skin color was given almost no social significance at all. And I tell this to my students, and it's just, what? But how could they miss something so obvious? It's like, because skin color, it's the social significance of that in this society at this time. So contingency, it didn't have to look this way. It could have looked some other way, right? We're always plugging the history because we're historians. History obviously is the answer. That's the best I can do, at least.
Yeah, I would just add to that to say that by teaching students that these types of theories are contingent and motivated by a specific kind of politics will help clear that up in terms of saying that we simply don't think that way anymore.
Oh.
And explaining how and why.
Hi, my name is Shailesh Kumar. I'm from NHGRI. So very thought-provoking talk. Thank you for the lecture. I want to know, racism is kind of color-coded, and I wanted to know your view on casteism, which is not color-coded, especially from South Asia. So how do you view that? Is it different from racism? And the other question is, how do you view the conspecific empathy, which transcends over religions? Like, does it transcend over religions? Because people normally get to be more compassionate about their own, like, conspecifics. And I have one more question, if I may. Recently, Richard Dawkins, he had put out a poll on Twitter that should IQ enhancing drugs should be given to public, like should it be sold, should it be banned? So do you view this like kind of a new idea of eugenics, and how does it affect in different races and cultures? Thank you.
So I am no scholar of India or the caste system. I can speak to certain, I know from conversation I have had, so I'm an American. Americans are obsessed, race equals color, color equals race, which is an idea that simply doesn't travel across the globe, right? That's a not uniquely American thing, but it is a specific, there's a specific history there, and it's located at a specific place or places, right? And as you say, in India, the caste system comes from Hindu traditions and is not coded the same way in the body. Correct. All right. So American students, when I describe this, are always mystified. Well, then, how does anybody ever know, right? And I talk to people from India, and it's like, They know from your name, from where you're from how you dress. And so this is like an ethnocentric sort of idea, which isn't the same thing as racism, but is a close ally. But again, it doesn't travel. So a personal story, my son-in-law is Irish. My daughter lives in Ireland. And Ireland has the Travelers, which are nomadic groups that are much despised, much the way the Roma are on continental Europe. And they are marked by these things, their accent, for example, clear giveaway. And Ogie, my son-in-law, talked about he was in a bar and because he's Irish and ethnocentrism, and there's a person there, a woman there sitting at the bar, and by his accent he can tell immediately she's a traveler, right? And the racism against these, or the ethnocentrism against these people is just overt there in a way that it is not over here towards anybody anymore, right? And so he says to him, he says, I said to myself, I'll be a good liberal Irish, and I sat and I talked with her, and and she said she's just back visiting. She had moved to Australia, and she said the second I got off the plane in Australia, I was Irish for the first time in my life, right? I'd never been Irish in Ireland. So it doesn't travel, so it changes over time. I'll stop there. David, you answer the hard questions.
3 different questions, and one of them, the first one is on caste, which I'm not a scholar of either, but I was wondering if you could help me with something on that. In David Reich's book, which is called Who We Are and How We Got Where We Are, I don't know, something like that, he has a chapter on this showing that in population movements of modern humans, that in fact people in South India are genetically as differentiated from people in the North as, remember these compare, as some other group is. All these differences that he uses for population targets, more different than X and more different than Y. It's a very simple mathematics to work with. But apparently this caused this huge reaction. And I never understood why it caused the reaction. Do you know why?
The way I see this as is just to maintain a kind of hierarchy, or a kind of to maintain their entitlements. They want to have like democracy, anything above them, and they want kind of total control in the caste system. They want to maintain this, and in the name of like a social glue. This is a glue. This is how the society is made, especially in India. So they want to have this kind of a full freedom, a democracy, and they want to maintain that entitlements, what they have. They don't want to lose it. That's why the casteism still survives in India.
So this looked like it gave genetic support to the caste system, basically, right?
Probably, yeah.
I will say this, something we haven't talked about much is it's really impossible to talk about race without talking about power relations.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Race, so some of our philosophy of science cousins want to talk about, well, we need to really get a philosophical definition of race as if race was something like liquid or solid, right, that existed outside of a social context. No, race was an idea that was born out, the power relations come first. So the United States and South America and the Caribbean had racialized slavery before they had a concept of race. And race was invented as a post hoc justification when slavery was attacked as a way to justify slavery. It's not that racism came first, and that's why we enslaved African populations. It's because we enslaved African populations, and then we had to figure out some sort of conceptual justification for it. So the caste system sounds very much like that, right? It's a way to entrench current power relationships.
So I think to add to moving into your second question about empathy and its extent, I think that the way I look at this, kind of like Montagu, the presupposition about human movements is that the role of culture is very, very, very important. Culture is based primarily on this absolute domination of the one trait of mimetic ability that humans have. We are tremendously mimetic. That's how we learn. That's how we teach our kids. It has affected our biology. It's extended our life cycle so that elders can be sticking around long enough to teach the young, right, that the presupposition should be in culture. Now, it is perfectly true that human species has gone through tremendous numbers of changes in who they empathize with. And that on the whole, it's getting bigger. But there's nothing, I mean, to say, oh, we're born empathetic, as if that were some primordial thing, that's probably false. A historical story can be told. Do genes come into it? Yes, but they may not be the leading indicator, they may be the trailing indicator. In the way, for instance, in which mimesis has shaped so many of our features over again, including our eye color and the colors of our, the color of our white, so that people can read us. I have this natural tendency to get closer to you when I'm talking to you, because being in an amphitheater is hard. I want to see the whites of your eyes because I can read your intentions, right? And see your reaction. A student, really, a teacher, you know, some of you have been teachers. You know when you're laying an egg, you can just tell from the faces, right? I'm not sure any other species has that amount of mimetic ability. So I think that we ought to think about, yes, empathy is natural. Yes, empathy is probably got genetic supporters, as it were. But the degree to which we extend it is extremely variable in the history of the world, depending on the extent of the interactions. So I got the number two question. I don't know what the third one.
So there's two other questions.
Yeah.
Okay,
Please
so
go ahead.
I wanted to reflect today's discussion back on the NIH and posit the idea that the NIH might be part of the problem in America, and it goes like this. If races are not scientifically defensible, isn't it a contradiction of scientific purpose for the NIH to spend so much energy and policy regarding race in medicine and research, the requirement to involve different races in research studies? Does this not give a patina of scientific validity to the concept of race for the NIH to recognize races in its policies? And would it not provide a better example to our nation and the world for the NIH to stop this unscientific practice?
Well, oh, sorry.
You go ahead.
Okay. Social constructions can have real biological consequences. So that race in this country is a product of historical circumstances that cause us to have a certain sets of social arrangements, certain differences in distributions of incomes, certain things about level of education people can have, based on a complete social fiction that there are races, does not mean that health consequences of those social arrangements are false.
Right.
So
why don't we call them ethnicity instead of having one ethnicity, which is Hispanic? Why don't we recognize ethnicities? And also, as the previous discussion went around, the power equation of access to care and education.
Right. So this actually would tie into this Richard Dawkins, if we have a drug to raise IQs. It's like, you know what, let's first make sure everybody has adequate health care, nutrition, good education. Let's do that first, and then we'll see if we can raise people's IQ through a magic drug. So the categories, so your argument is the categories we use, that the NIH currently uses are too capacious to have any social meaning, right? So like Asian American has a wide variety, so Filipino Americans live much different lives than Chinese Americans and things like that, right? So yes, as the tools get better, your health
and
your
Polish
healthcare
Americans eat more Polish sausage. Maybe that's not good for you. So
that's right.
and I think I broke one of the rules. I'm Chuck Selden. I'm at the Center for Scientific Review.
Well, thank you for
certainly
a very searching question, but I wouldn't presume to tell you the answer because I don't live here. One thing to keep in mind, I think, is that historically, the history of molecular genetics is very, very different from the history of population genetic Darwinism. And they only intersected in the 50s and the 60s. And that intersection is still in process, right? one of the things that I would keep people bear in mind is that if you're going to do molecular genetics and you're using categories in which you would sort people out for one, like for instance the development of a drug, right, that you could market to, you say, oh, we're helping people like this because this group, for instance, is prone to such and such a disease at such as a higher rate than some other group, we're going to help. But in order to make that point, you're assuming that you're going to use this concept of whatever the group is in an innocent way to perform a thing. But the concept is not innocent, right?
Without doing the empirical test to see whether they have the trait or not.
Well, that would be even more important. So that would be an ideological distortion in the way in which the researchers program is set up. But I would think that from my point of view, population genetics and quantitative genetics is absolutely essential in the real world context to identifying the groups for which you might want to develop drugs. I've seen slippage like that like crazy. Like, for instance, by the time it hit the New York Times, and then that quote from David Reich himself, who's not a dummy, he says, Africans, right? But actually, his point about, say, sickle cell anemia treatments is actually pretty much focused on descendants of Bantu-speaking people in West Africa. Why does he say Africans? Old 18th century word. That's really not smart, right?
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So we've got one question here and one question here. So if you have a quick question, I know you've been waiting, and we'll get back to you.
So I've been thinking a little bit about...
who are you and where?
Oh, yeah. Right, sorry. My name's Dan. I'm a graduate student in NHGRI, or NIDDK, sorry. This is but a current issue at sort of the intersection of genetics and race, I think, is some of these DNA-based ancestry tests that are happening.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just wondering to hear your guys' thoughts on them, and specifically if you think some of the results people are getting and interpreting might be actually entrenching some of these old, like, debunked concepts and of race.
Yeah, so you're talking like 23andMe,
Yeah,
that kind of thing?
Ancestry.com.
Ancestry.
So I'm no geneticist, it's probably obvious, and I know there's lots of them here, but I fundamentally don't quite understand this process. So I've had friends who've done this, and oh, it turns out I'm, 20% Norwegian. Well, what is it? If species, at what point in time was your ancestry 20% Norwegian? Right? I don't quite understand when 23andMe decides, okay, we're going to stop. Eventually we're all African, right? I mean, so I honestly don't understand. It gives this great kind of certainty to things, right? But yeah, certainty to some things, but also, oh, I always thought we were all Irish, and now I find out that we're also some Spanish. Well, I think, okay, I'm mystified. That's my answer.
Well, I had the same thing. All I can report to you, I think it's a question that's really worth thinking about, and it's not a trivial question because it's now completely widespread through the population. I mean, everybody does it. So I'm with my relatives, and we're talking about our Ancestry.com results. And this is a schizophrenic conversation. On the one hand, I'm really playing this game. On the other hand, the guy who's the historian of population genetics, this is really crazy. and I don't. So, and what happened in one particular case is that I and my cousin were comparing a result that I thought was on one side of the family, turned out to be on the Irish side. Okay, because of who my cousins were, which side of the cousins were. And it was another guy from Spain. So some guy from Spain is in there, right? So you invent these just so stories, right? These are the shipwrecked sailors from the Armada. That's the first of them. And I'm thinking, wow, what an interesting game, but I'm not so sure it's a great idea. But I don't know how you'd stop it. I mean, what do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah, not so easy, huh?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that, maybe that's not.
No, I
Go
guess to maybe clarify a little bit is I'm just wondering if the way that it reports back these categories, like, oh, you're 10% from this
Yeah,
geographic
10%.
enclave, and from that, if that's just sort of in some way helping to justify or entrench certain ways people think about these different
Right.
subgroups. And when it's given in sort of these terms of this percentage and stuff, it makes it sort of seem more certain and concrete, and that this is a real group, that you are this part, that this percentage of you is a part of.
Right.
And I guess I'm just wondering what sort of cultural impact you think that might be having.
Well, I think you just outlined it. I think that it
Yeah.
reifies those categories, and they're pretty vague to begin with, right?
I think
They
it
are-
reifies another thing as well. Not only does it reify the existence of 10% of this group and this group is a real thing, but it also reifies the idea that your genes are what you really are.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what you really are.
And
So
you've
my,
got-
so my
and-
son-in-law, who's Irish, is constantly frustrated by Americans like David. Oh, I'm Irish. He says, no, you're not. You're an American. I'm Irish, right? Right? This idea that that's what we really are. That's what I am. I'm that. I'm my genes.
Right.
It's like, no, you have a body. You live in a
And
society.
guess what? Those are identified with certain stereotype traits. And they start flipping that around, right? So now you are really back to the olden days. I'm beginning to see the question in a more suspicious light by the minute. Thank you.
I'm going to get to the other question.
Yeah, so getting back to the question about why, I'm Roland Owens with the Office of the Director at NIH. And getting back to the question of why it's important to have diversity in human subjects research, there was a clear example. A lot of our epidemiologists tend to go to European records because the Europeans have the cradle-to-grave medical records. And we were studying prostate cancer and in European populations, and then one of our African-American investigators said, well, black people are dying from prostate cancer more than white people. Why don't you include some black families? And when we did that, the markers started to pop, and so that's why it's important.
Yeah.
Right, and black populations also have, I think of mental health and things like that, right? They're less likely to seek professional help for things like depression and things like that, right? So, that's cultural, exactly right. Those are cultural things, as well as, all kinds of, healthcare in this country is a mess, right? And it's expensive. And let's equalize environments for everybody, make sure everybody has access to the things they should have access to, and then maybe we can work towards helping you with your research. Do I want socialized medicine? As it seems to work, I don't know. Sure, yeah. What the hell?
Okay.
Can you guys do something about that?
No. There's a question there, please.
Hi, Eric Padmore. I'm from NHLBI. A couple of quick comments. 22% Irish. I'm a Ancestry.com junkie. And just to add a couple of references to the conversation, you brought up the whole Irish question. So there's a book called To Hell or Barbados, which is about the enslavement of the Irish populations under Cromwell, who then sent them to the Caribbean, which is how I end up being 22% Irish. Fascinating book, and really points out the separation of those populations, because most people don't realize that Irish people in the 16th century didn't speak English, so they were the others. So that's something to read. The second one I want to throw out is a book by James Whitman, I think I got the name right, called Hitler's American Model. Have you encountered that? And if you have, I wondered what your reaction to that.
I've read a number of books on that subject, but maybe not that one.
Right, but talks about how the Nazi race laws, and particularly the Nuremberg laws of 1932, were actually derived from American Jim Crow laws. And the takeaway there was the Nazis actually sent somebody to the U.S., looked at Jim Crow and said, no, that's too extreme. We can't go that far, right? So
The nasty part of that story.
just wondered if you wanted to comment on it.
No, but thank you for the references, and in fact, maybe we'll try to get together a list of references that would be really good, because if the burden is to ask you to read some history, to just not to find something in it, but to get your juices going so that your memory, your cultural memory gets wider, and then when you're in situations like this, you know how to respond, right? So this is a golden age of history writing. I don't know why, people neglect that. But the other part of that story was told years ago by Daniel Kevels, that the states that they thought were not too excessive, like Jim Crow South, were actually the progressive states in the United States. They adopted, I'm from California, and the Nazis relied on the California eugenic laws as moderate beginnings for this. And so after the war, as Kevels tells the story in the book called Not in the Name of Eugenics. Yes.
Name of Eugenics.
It's an old book.
85.
85? Okay. After the war and after this kumbaya moment of having defeated racism biologically and putting it in the margins, which is the evolutionary biologists and people like Sherwood Washburn think they had actually accomplished. And that's why, parenthetically, by the way, that's why it's such a surprise to see it resurfacing now, because everybody thought it was extinguished, like measles or something, you know. But going back to Kevels, everybody wanted to think, oh my gosh, why is it that the eugenic laws in the United States, such as they were, as in California, were all clustered in states that regarded themselves as progressive? And that's a nasty little story for the left to tell, or the sort of left that we have. And the other thing is that when it was stopped mostly in Congress by a representative of the big city Catholic machines, who are because of their views about human life, which are the ones that actually put an end to it. And it wasn't anything which the scientists could take credit for. I'm sure that big city boss named McCarthy or something had never read a word of Dobzhansky or Montagu, but they're the ones that stopped it.
So I'll say just two quick things.
We've got two other questions.
Okay. The Nazi Connection by Stefan Kuhl is a great book on American eugenicists' influences in Nazi Germany. Clarence Campbell, Harry Laughlin visited Nazi Germany, Laughlin's model sterilization law. It definitely was a progressive thing. The trick, of course, is the Supreme Court case that said involuntary sterilization was constitutional. Oliver Wendell Holmes has this famous line. It's like, if the state can involuntarily vaccinate people, it can certainly involuntarily sterilize people. And we would agree with the first part of that probably, but not the second. And so we have to tease out. It's not just a matter of yeah, it was progressive, absolutely. Also gave us meat inspection, which, yay, and the FDA, and terrific. Sterilization, ugh. So it's not just a matter of, progressives are bad. We have to sort those things out. Sorry.
Yeah, so
I'll
go
let you.
ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name's Madison Esposito. I'm a postback in NHGRI. I was wondering if you could describe what your view is on, like, if we ever get there, what a post-racist world would be like, and if it would require a level of acculturation.
Acculturation?
So the loss of culture in specific groups.
Oh, which you regard as a bad thing.
I've been teaching about this. I've been teaching about this stuff for 20 odd years, and every year, the thing about teaching is you get older. Your students are always 18, 19, 20. And every year I hear, well, that's what people used to think. Our generation doesn't think that. And I've been hearing it for 20 years, 25 years. Would it cause, so in some ways we do live in a post-racial world, right? We don't talk about the Alpines, the Nordics, and the Mediterranean European races anymore. We don't talk about, there's a great book, How the Irish Became White.
Yeah.
White people live in a post-racial world, right? And so and the second part, can we get all the way? Keep working at it, folks. And the second part is, would it cause like an assimilationist sort of thing?
Sure.
Where
yeah.
cultural pattern. Yeah,
So-
That's a worse, that's a kind of a mass culture argument, right? You
Yeah.
just get homogenized.
So for example, American Jews are very concerned about this, right?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be an American Jew, right? Well, we don't keep kosher, we don't have we don't speak the language anymore, and we don't
marry
There's
other Jews.
out marriage rates which are through the roof. That's how things go, and I don't have an answer to that. Certainly, some things stay with you, some things don't. I like sauerkraut on my pizza. It's really good, you guys. That's a cultural trait from my childhood, so I don't know. Some things are going to disappear, some things aren't.
It does occur to me, though, to say that when we're talking about that, sometimes there's a kind of utopian aspect to that, a kind of discourse about wouldn't that be great, with a certain kind of techno-scientism attached to it. One of the problems with that kind of thinking is that anticipates results as if they were already here, and that all we have to do is do a little research and we'll find out. That is, to me, a big defect of the kind of thinking that Richard Dawkins have. They sort of presuppose that we're going to wind up where they are, but you don't know that because of contingency, right? You have no idea. But so I would bear that in mind. Don't take fantasized results as if you're for something as already having anywhere near there, right? Secondly, I don't think anybody should ever talk about post-racialism until they recognize that large numbers of people in the United States are living in definitely not a post-racial society. They're encountering racial prejudice every single day, and it's so obvious to them they can't see why anybody would ever think otherwise, right? And I think that has to be acknowledged. So those are two sides of the same coin of fantasizing your way out of it and using scientific language to do it. It's not a smart idea.
Okay, so we've got. Thank you. We've got one question here and one. So keep them short because the answers are getting quite long.
Yes.
Trying to earn our money.
Yes, and in Scandinavia they
This is
cover
a good
their
question.
American-style pizzas in shrimp.
Yeah, Sweden, they served me a pizza and it wasn't cut. It was just this round thing, and I'm looking around, they forgot to cut this pizza, and I look around and everybody's just with their knife and fork eating their pizzas wrong.
Yes, I was referred by John Agnes Campbell about your work, and rightly so.
John.
The presentation was very good, thank you. Would it be plausible to say that we should change the terminology race to be more synonymous with species, Homo sapiens sapiens, and then to use ethnicity or ethnic characteristics for the
that's been
variety
the
of all the human
strong
attributes.
monogenism about species.
As Ashley Montagu said.
Then the question is the Dobzhansky-Montagu question, shouldn't you just abandon race? Actually, most people have in the technical. For instance, Reich never uses it in his book. He just says population and leaves it at that, except in the editorial he has this scare quote thing which brings the whole question right back up. So that's probably a good idea.
And to
But
build
you
on
still
that-
have to mark populations that are moving through time and space. You got to have some word to do that. And I don't think ethnic group does it precisely because of the characteristics Montagu liked, which is its reference to culture. You still have to find markers for populations that are or are not diverging from others. You just got to do that.
I would say this about the difference, and this will be a quick answer, promise, Chris. David Hollinger, the historian, makes a very useful thing, which ethnicity is something you can choose to embrace or not. So European Americans can choose to embrace their Irish or German or Spanish or whatever heritage they have. We do this every Christmas. We opened our presents Christmas Eve because we're of German heritage. That was apparently a German thing, no idea. Race socially doesn't work that way. You cannot choose. I choose not to be black. I choose to be Asian. It doesn't seem to work that way, right? So there's a social difference there that I think is important.
Yeah, my name is Belen Hurley, and I work in the Genome Institute as an educator specialist. And this is not really a question, this is just a comment. When you were talking about finding creative ways to engage the public and unearth their beliefs and their hidden models and stuff, I actually think Ancestry.com reports and this whole wave of looking into your ancestry is a very good entry into these conversations.
Okay.
For instance, I have had many times the experience of talking to an American that did Ancestry.com and says like, oh, my report was so boring. There was a big dot in England and that was it. so they sort of like, they kind of were looking, maybe, is there anything interesting in my background, you know? And then the big dot in England kind of killed their fun. And this is the same people that will get extra excited if they could go to England, to a little town, and find all the records of everybody who was marrying their family. And, you know, it was awesome. There was so much information in that little town. I could find the graves of my ancestors. And so, you know, in one way, it's the genealogical sort of
in.
Yeah, it was like exciting to find all those marriage records, but it was boring that you were from there. You know, it's kind of like it doesn't make much sense. And then I have another conversation with a Puerto Rican woman who said, as a Puerto Rican, we expect to have African, European, and indigenous results in our reports. And when I did my report, if I had no indigenous sort of like a percentage significant, I would have been crushed and devastated because, you know, that would kind of erase some of my Puerto Rican sort of identity. So just different experiences from different people, and I feel like you talk to a person from African American, you have another story. So it is a good point to unearth, you know, expectations, beliefs, models, and things. So I think it's worth looking at it in
That's
from
an
education.
excellent point.
Yeah.
But at some point on our model, they got to face questions like, what does it mean to be 20% of this, that, or the other thing? True. And that turns out to be a hard question. Yeah.
All right, so any further questions? Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.